Welcome to the Together for Good podcast, a podcast specially designed to inspire, challenge, and uplift you during your daily walk of faith. Today's episode, I sit down with my friend Tyler Hauger. Tyler works for the Karibu Foundation in Oslo, Norway. He's one of my best friends in the entire world, and he's really smart and has so many great things to share with us. He works specifically doing peace and justice work through this foundation all throughout the world. And he's got a lot to share with us. There's a lot of really cool things that go on in this conversation. We talk about vocation a little bit and what it means to be led along by God into meaningful work. We talk about how peace and justice overlap and how that's a really essential part of our Christian calling, and about care for the other is at the heart of what it means to live out our faith. We talk about a whole bunch of other things too. It's a really good conversation. I hope you love it because I loved creating it and spending the time with Tyler. As always, thanks for listening to this podcast, for making it a part of your routine. Thanks for the kind comments that you email me or tell me when you see me in church, things like that. And yeah, share it with your friends. The more, the merrier. I'm very excited for other interviews we've got coming up. But now let's get to this one, shall we? Here is an interview with my friend, Tyler Hauger. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of Together for Good. I have on the line, all the way from Oslo, Norway, one of my best friends in the entire world, Tyler Hauger. And
hello.
I'm so excited, Tyler. I can't believe you're here. Technology is wonderful. What time is it there? What time is it like?
It is 8 p.m., but since we're in Norway, it looks like it's about 12 noon because the days are so long now.
Oh, that's right. But then you get the bad side of that in the winter when you have like sunlight from 10 till 3, right?
We don't talk about that part. We just talk about
the beautiful summer months.
The beautiful southern months. Yeah.
Well, so it's so cool that we were able to make this work, that we found a way for our schedules to coincide despite the huge time difference and the geography. And I'm so excited to have you on to talk about the really good, important work that you do. But first, before we get into any of that, we need to allow the listeners to just know a little bit about how you and I know each other. I'll start by saying, Tyler, of all the men I know, you are the best. Because you were the best man in my wedding.
That's true.
Which was, my gosh, I should know this, 12 years
12
ago
years
now?
ago. It was 12 years ago, yeah.
I'm glad you know that. Thank you.
That's my job.
But yeah, why don't you? I'll let you talk. Let the listeners know how we know each other, and just tell us a little bit about yourself too.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I am originally from North Dakota, so I grew up on the prairie, and I was pretty actively involved in ELCA youth ministries, both synod-wide in North Dakota, but also nationally, church-wide, and also internationally. And that is where Pastor Nate and my stories crossed. Is you and I, Nate, we worked together on the national boards of the ELCA, the youth boards.
Yes, we did.
And you and I had a close minds meet from when we were 16, and from there we were college roommates. So that's where we started. The origins.
The origin story. Yeah. I believe it was during like a get to know you game at some sort of Lutheran. Oh, it was the convention, I believe, when we walked into each other, and you were Tyler from North Dakota, and I was Nate from New York.
From New York, yeah.
And the rest is history, as they say.
The rest is history, yeah. So we have a long history, Nate. So it's very good to be with you here now.
Yeah, and so you went to St. Olaf just like I did. Good school, good Lutheran school there in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And if I remember, you were a religion and poli-sci major, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, I got it right. And so that's kind of led you along the way. Tell us a little bit more about, going from the farmlands or the prairies of North Dakota, beautiful North Dakota. And then you study religion and political science in college. And then you had a super cool experience for your first year out of college, I remember.
Yeah, that's right. No, I mean, for me, I was always interested in sort of where the lines between religion and people's faith traditions and politics meet. But I wasn't really ever interested in sort of the party political things that we see so often in the US. I was sort of interested in more structures and systems, and where structures keep people in poverty and where systems keep people discluded from the conversation. And where does this meet up with religion? So that sort of religion background, as I called it at the time, political science and religion, was a really great entry point into getting a little bit of a start in these type of questions. So that was the years at St. Olaf. I afterwards moved from the prairie, as they say, to Palestine and Israel. So directly out of college, I took an internship with the Lutheran World Federation, so the Lutheran Church's global development arm, working with Palestinian refugees in the West Bank and in Israel. And I spent over a year there, really immersed in where you see systems of power and oppression and pain and joy all meeting at the same exact place, all in the name of a religion sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting mixing point, can you say?
No kidding. And I mean, obviously, this is something that's been in the news a lot lately with the brief war recently between Palestine and Israel. And that is what I always say is, I'm like, that is a very complicated situation. And anyone that tries to just to tell it to you in black and white is missing decades of nuance in terms of how this all got started. And I don't need you to go into all the details on that. But I will just allow you to say a little bit more about maybe what some of the things that you learned, because I'm sure you went into that internship with certain preconceptions and ideas about what your work would be and what it entailed. And I'm sure living there in the Holy Land for a full year. By the way, after college, I went to Buffalo, New York, so I don't know who got the better end of that deal.
Buffalo's a lovely place as well.
It's very inexpensive.
It's true.
So, but tell us more about, just any observations. And again, like, I know you could probably talk for hours about this, but maybe some things that might be of interest to our listeners.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think the first thing I can say is it is a complicated place because, as I said, it's a place where politics and religion and theology and world history and global power politics all meet at the same place. And it's where tax money from different countries support systems that keep people in poverty and oppression, and in other places where people's theology keep people in systems of cycles of violence. So it's a really complex place. At the same time, it's one of the most exciting, beautiful, joyous places where people have a lot of hope on both sides that we can find solutions together. But I think I went in there with sort of a very naive approach that peace is easy. It's just all finding a common ground. But I think I did my master's research on Israel and Palestine, and I remember I was talking to a rabbi, an Israeli rabbi, who was talking about peace and dialogue processes in Israel and Palestine. And he said, so often we just want to talk about faith, we just want to talk about religion. So in these interfaith dialogues between Muslims and Christians, Jews, let's talk about let me talk about Ramadan, let me talk about Hanukkah, let me talk about Christmas, let's talk about those things. That's what keeps us together. But the rabbi said to me, well, imagine if you're sitting at a conversation table and me, the rabbi, my chair is on your toe and you're a Palestinian Christian. And the whole time I'm saying, let's talk about Christmas. But me as a Palestinian Christian, I'm saying, well, your chair's on my toe. This is really hurting me. I can't talk about these traditions, these faith things until you move the chair because it's hurting my toe. So I think that's what surprised me along the way is I think peace is more complex because it has to do with making systems that are equal and systems that include everyone, not put pain or exclude people.
Yeah, and it's funny, that's a great analogy. It's very reminiscent too of when Jesus says you have to remove the log in your own eye before you can take the speck out of someone else's. And it's it's just kind of taking that a step further to say if real substantive dialogue is going to happen, you have to edit some of the systems to remove the inequality and the pain and the struggle that's happening there. That's fascinating.
Or at the very least, you can't pretend like the inequality doesn't exist. And I think that's something that the U.S. has learned as the Black Lives Matter movement has become something that so many people can stand for and relate to. Is you have to name the inequality, and if you're not naming the inequality, you can't really take a step forward. So I think that also relates to some of the experiences I had in Israel and Palestine back in that year.
Absolutely. Well, and so then after that year, you end up moving to Norway, correct? You moved directly.
Yeah, a quite different place than the Holy Land.
Correct.
A quite different place.
Correct.
That's right. Hmm.
And what was the compelling factor that made you move to Norway? I think I have an idea, but
Well, I mean, I can start with the long history and say that my mother still speaks Norwegian and my grandparents still speak Norwegian, so the tradition is very strong. But in my case, it was a lovely fiance, my soon-to-be wife. I followed her to Norway afterwards, who is a Norwegian citizen.
correct. Who you
So
met
I
at St.
followed my
Olaf.
heart to
Yes.
Norway.
You followed your heart to Norway, and Jelna's just the best, and yeah, very impressive. She's going to be on the podcast too because she has all sorts of wisdom. You made a good move, Tyler, all the way to Norway.
Yeah.
But all this experience of Israel-Palestine, living there, seeing the conflict and the injustice, the passion that you developed while studying in your undergrad, all of these are pieces of your story that then kind of lead you to the Karibu Foundation, correct? You have been working with them for 7 years, yeah.
No, now it's been a decade. I've been working there for 10 years. That's
oh my gosh.
right.
Okay.
So I'm working with the Karibu Foundation, and it's a private Norwegian foundation that provides grants to different human rights organizations, different civil society organizations in the global South. And when I talk about the global South, that's meaning Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and Asia. It has the term global South has a historical and a power analysis built in sort of the old colonial histories and the countries that were once colonialized. And so we provide grants to movements that are trying to make the world a better place by looking at the systems around us. And I've been there for 10 years now. So time really flies by.
Yeah, and what led you, I would just love to hear a little bit about what led you to pursuing that job opportunity when you arrived in Norway.
Yeah, I mean, I moved to a country that has values that really speak to my values. It's a country that's really built on economic justice, on gender justice, on social justice. Norway is not perfect by any means, but the systems that it's built up are ones that try to ensure that everyone has equal rights. And so that tradition is very strong here. And Karibu is one of the few Norwegian private foundations that's really providing funds to movements that are trying to do that on a global level in some way, shape, or form. I was super intrigued by this. It works with both faith-based groups, so Christian, Jewish, Muslim groups, but also completely secular groups, all saying, what do we need to do to make a world a better place? Because another world is possible. It's the other world that we're working for is there. What do we have to do to make that happen? And I was really inspired by the movements on the ground in Argentina, in Palestine, in South Africa, in Ecuador, that were doing small and big moves to make the world a better place. And it really spoke to me, and it was really exciting. So I'm very fortunate to get to know these movements and hear their stories on a daily basis.
Yeah, what I love about what you're saying too is who you are and how you understand yourself and your values, right? We're seeing all the pieces of your story and how it's led you to this work. And that's just really good vocational theology, to use nerdy terms to go along with it, but that you grew up in a household and with grandparents who spoke Norwegian, right? Like this is a big part of who you are. And then you end up in Norway just because love brought you there. But your experiences in Israel and Palestine and studying political science and religion, all of these are little pieces and breadcrumbs along the way that lead you to working with this organization that does peace and justice work throughout the world, that pulls upon your sense of instilling, living out the best of what your homeland has to offer. Right? There's so much cool stuff that I hope you realize and recognize about your story that is just really beautiful, the way all of the parts kind of weave together there.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it's funny. We started the conversation saying, where did you and I meet, Nate, and where do we come from? And it's funny, the vocation stories, these vocational origin stories. You might think that it's an obvious, these steps are obvious, these breadcrumbs are obvious, and this is where we would all end up. But it's like pulling on a string of a sweater, and you don't know where it's going, and you just keep pulling, and you're interested in the next thing, and you keep pulling the string, and it leads you somewhere else, and it leads you somewhere else. And it's also trusting that the plan you have doesn't always work out, and that's not a bad thing. It sometimes takes you to places you never would have imagined, and lets you meet people that you never would have got the chance to meet if you hadn't followed those breadcrumbs.
Yeah, and it's funny too how you don't really notice the breadcrumbs until you view the story in reverse.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of the things that you experienced along the way didn't feel like the next logical step necessarily, but now as you look at the bigger narrative, it's like, oh, look at that. Like, that's kind of cool how it all worked out.
Yeah.
Well, so talk to me then a little bit more about your sense. I know what also played into this. You were a religion major. You and I met doing, ELCA youth stuff because we loved the church and our faith was really important to us growing up. And I know that's a part of why you do this work too, which part of why I wanted to bring you on. So talk to us just a little bit about how you've come to understand it. I know there was a book that was really important to you too.
So it's interesting because like I said, I grew up in rural North Dakota, and these questions of global justice were not necessarily the ones that we engaged on a daily basis. There's a lot of exciting things happening in rural communities, without a doubt. I've been listening to great podcasts about rural communities sort of rising and the beautiful things coming out of it. But the global justice questions were not the heart of my childhood. Was not the heart of what engaged me. But I think growing up in a rural place, you have a real sense of community. You have a sense of looking out for each other more than just me and my small family. And I think on the global level, you have to do that as well. And that includes sort of our own theologies. I, about 10 years ago, read a really exciting book that really allowed me to put my thoughts and theologies in a language that makes sense to me. And it was a book called The Hole in Our Gospel, HOLE, the missing part of our gospel. And it was by a man called Richard Stearns, who was the head of a humanitarian organization called World Vision. And it's really talking about how, when we look at the gospel, one thing that we always forget about is the social justice story of the Bible, and the story of preaching to the poor and the oppressed and those on the margins, and saying that too often we go through the routines of just going to church, reading the Bible, talking to each other about small devotionals, without looking at what can we actually do to address issues of oppression, marginalization, and injustice. So this book really gave me a language to talk about these things in a new way. And then another book that I've really appreciated along the way is a book by one of my personal heroes, Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. And for your listeners, I'm sure it's a name that they know, the anti-apartheid hero, Anglican bishop. There's a book called God Is Not a Christian, and it's about speaking truth in times of crisis, and the idea that if we stay just in our own Christian bubbles, sometimes we miss the opportunity to work collaboratively across borders to stop injustice, that we need to be able to hold hands and work together to do this. And I think that's really where I'm at to now theologically, is we really need to find ways to reach out across our barriers to address big issues, because these are huge issues. Poverty is a huge issue, injustice, huge issue, and we need to find solutions together, regardless of our faith tradition. But we have a special responsibility as Christians, I think.
Yeah. And the Hole in Our Gospel, I haven't read that particular book, but I've read some other similar ones, and it really is startling and groundbreaking once you put those glasses on, of saying, yeah, God cares about those people who are oppressed, those people who are vulnerable. And then you just start reading through the Bible and you're like, wait a second, like, this is everywhere.
Yeah.
The chosen people were slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and God heard their cries and brought them to freedom. And then God says again and again, it's so often articulated, God reminds the Israelites, says, I'm the God that brought you out of Egypt. And so therefore, you should care for the orphan and the widow. You should welcome the immigrant and, those beyond your borders. And then you look at Jesus, who kind of takes it a step further and is constantly going to the lands and the areas where there weren't, the not accepted people were, whether it was talking with prostitutes or with lepers, or just healing people who were sick, or just going into the Gentile regions to teach and preach and perform miracles. It was always this like expanding, and that's always what got him into trouble. The high priest's like, wait, you can't do that. Like that doesn't fit within the box. And Jesus kind of like, no, like, I think you need a new box. But it's really, it was really, I had a similar experience, and I can't remember the book. I think I read God of the Oppressed by James Cone, who's a famous modern day theologian, just died a few years ago, taught at Union Seminary in New York. And just opening your eyes to see, once you have those lenses, it's suddenly everywhere. And it feels like every reading on a Sunday morning somehow references, oh, by the way, like, care about people who are on the downside, care about the vulnerable, care about the oppressed. That's your work as a Christian. And it's really fascinating.
I think too, the encounter with human suffering, whether that's very local in your own communities or on a global level, it requires us to act. It requires us to move out of our comfort zone and to challenge why this is happening. And I think that's what you see also in the gospel texts that you're talking about, Nate, is that it's challenging the structures. It's not just charity. It's not just giving money to try to make the situation a little bit better. It's to challenge the root causes. And I think that's really something that we should take with us along the way.
I don't know who said it originally or where this quip comes from, but I've heard it said that the work of the gospel is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think that's very powerful and profound, is to recognize that when we feel really comfortable and that we're in a place of privilege, that it sometimes can be the Holy Spirit calling us to use that privilege, use those resources to care for those who are without.
Absolutely.
So the one thing I do want to pick up on, just because you mentioned it, I liked how your mention of your North Dakota upbringing and smaller towns and really caring for each other and looking out for the neighbor. You did that on a micro level, and now it's just expanded to a macro sense. And I'll just mention to our listeners, but within a week of Tyler and I arriving on the St. Olaf campus, Tyler knew every single person who was from North Dakota. I know that was a really big deal. And then that if, I was supposed to suddenly like this person that you had met because they were from North Dakota, even though I had no connection to the place other than you. But really, and every time I meet someone from North Dakota, that they love North Dakota and they love people from North Dakota, and that's just such an important piece of the puzzle.
The irony is now I live in Norway, and it's very similar. You find out who else is from Norway, and you find out who they know, and quickly you realize you're related in some way. So it's similar. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
Well, and that's just the work of it, right? Like caring for your fellow human beings and caring about someone else as much as you care about yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus famously said.
Exactly that. And I think it's a matter of, in the work that we do on a daily basis, it's very easy to love someone who has the same politics as you, or love someone who has the same color skin, or love someone who lives in the same state, or love someone who has something in common with you. But it demands a lot more of the human creativity and human soul to love people that don't look like you, or love people that come from a completely different background. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that all of us should take with us on a daily basis, is how can we proactively work to love the people around us that don't share the same things as we do, and who deserve the exact same equal rights, regardless of what they look like or what kind of background they come from. So I think that's one thing we can all continue to do.
And I think the piece that can really help with having compassion for those who are very different than us is to recognize, as we've been talking about, how a person's life is the culmination of an entire long story that's been written for years and years. And there's so much that plays into who you are today, Tyler, who I am today. And it's the result of the thousands of experiences
Yeah.
And I'm blessed to have had the experiences that I did. And I had such a great, loving childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so many pieces that I just take for granted.
Yeah.
And then recognizing someone arrives at a completely different viewpoint, not because they're a bad person, but because they had different experiences.
Yeah.
And I recently read a book that talks about how, oh gosh, and I shouldn't even quote it because I don't remember the exact statistics, but people who are incarcerated in the United States tend to score off the charts on the adverse childhood experiences scale. Like they have this measure of how many adverse childhood experiences have you had, traumatic experiences as a child.
Right.
And if you score a 5 out of 10 or higher, there's a huge chance that you will end up incarcerated.
Right.
It really underlines and illustrates that point that we are the product of our experiences. And sometimes people end up in jail because yes, they made bad decisions, but also because of all of the things that came before that.
Yeah.
And that's just, for me, that's been a very helpful perspective for developing compassion for other people. Even people who haven't had really difficult childhoods or anything else, but just wind up politically in a totally different space than me, rather than just say like, oh, they're an idiot, I can't stand them, to try and think about like, okay, but how did they arrive here? What were
Right.
what brought them to this point in this opinion? Where can I find respect and common understanding too? Because oftentimes, especially in America here, we just want to put on our jerseys and argue for our team,
Right.
whether that's the left or the right. And if we can, learn to not just fall into simple categories, but to try and get below the surface to say, no, like, we're trying to build a better nation here. What does that look like? How can we do that? And that's where the real conversation can happen. So it all leads back to it. That was a long soliloquy from me. You're welcome. But it does bring me to a question that I wanted to ask you about. I know that in your work with your foundation, that you're really specific about letting the people on the ground kind of lead the day, because it's their experience. That's why I'm talking about all this other stuff. Their experience is vitally important for what's happening. So can you just say a little bit more about that fundamental principle you operate under?
Absolutely. That's thanks for asking that question. I mean, I think anytime you see a movement to challenge violence, to challenge injustice, to challenge poverty, they're complex issues. I mean, they are very complex issues, like we talked about at the beginning. But one principle that we really work by, and one principle that I've personally had a transformation process myself as a white male living in one of the world's most rich countries, is how do you work with communities that are really struggling and you want to have an impact. And the principle we live by or work by is often what I call nothing about us without us. The idea that those who are oppressed, those that are struggling for a most just world need to be the ones that are setting the agenda and need to be the ones that we stand together with. So their voices need to be at the table. So in all the work that we're doing, we're consistently checking in, saying nothing about us without us. Are we going to do advocacy work on behalf of movements in Ecuador who have had their rainforest community destroyed by oil spills? We can do advocacies. That's great. That's important. We need to speak out against this. There's a lot of voiceless communities, but simultaneously, the voices of those people are there. And by saying nothing about us without us, you're saying you and I are linking arms together, and you're helping set the agenda, or you're leading the way, and I'm walking alongside you. So that nothing about us without us, I think, is a really easier way, or at least at the very least, it's a way for us to approach very complex social justice issues, saying, what are the communities, what are the movements that are affected, what are they saying, and what are their I don't want to say demands, but what are their needs, what are the things that need to be changed, and we need to listen to those communities. So again, nothing about us without us is something that I've worked by, and on a personal level, I'm continually doing my very best to live by.
Yeah, and it's a real change of perspective too. I mean, because it also stems from, it's a very, very valuable, and it stems from being the rich nation just coming in to say, here's how you're supposed to do things.
Yeah.
And when you include the other people at the table, it totally changes the entire dynamics of it. Because frankly, rich country coming in and telling another country how to do things is colonization. That was exactly how it played out 500 years ago, is that, all those European countries went out and claimed the land for themselves and tried to tell the native people in wherever they landed how they should be living and what their life should be like. And that was very destructive and really did a lot of violence to the history of these communities that it didn't even get preserved. It's one of the things that I really gives me a lot of sadness too, is just thinking about how that approach has allowed us to lose so much wisdom and knowledge from other communities from the past. But what I love about what you're doing too is flipping that on its head, because it will create better and probably longer lasting effects in the areas too, I would imagine, because it's really stemming up from the individuals themselves who live there each and every day. At the end of the day, you go back to Oslo and you have no idea what's going on a day-to-day basis necessarily. Yeah.
Well, sorry, I remember. I traveled to Iraq a few years back, and we're working with communities who were living with the aftermath of war and military occupation for years and years and years. And you hear these immense stories of what happens, what has happened, both pain and joy from families in Iraq. And then the next day I return back to Oslo, to the comfort of my own home, and figure out, what do you do with that? What do you do with that? And I think it's really important, again, to turn this upside down and say the work that we're doing is not charity. It's challenging injustice, and it's really looking at root causes, so that when I come back, one thing I have to do is to say, well, what are the root causes here? What can I change? And I just want to sort of anecdotally, I know a lot of the movements that we work with in Africa, Latin America, Asia, Middle East, they often quote a indigenous Australian woman called Lila Watson, who says, if you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, let's work together. And in that sense, it flips all this on its head again, saying that your liberation is my liberation. This is not a pie where we're all trying to get all the resources, but your rights are my rights, and we need to work together so we all ensure these rights. And I think that's one of the lessons I've learned from the movements in the Global South that we're working with, is this cannot be a charity case. This has to be solidarity. This has to be our liberation is bound up together. The liberation of the human community is bound up together.
It's amazing. Thank you for sharing that quote, and the ways that it challenges us to think about, to move outside ourselves, because it really is a very Christian calling as well. The sermon I preached on Sunday for Pentecost dealt with the fact that the term for Jesus says, I'll send the advocate, and there's this Greek word paraclete that is the Greek form of advocate, and it means to be with and to call out. And how that's really the work of the Holy Spirit is, yes, to be with us, to give us some comfort and reassurance when things are really difficult, but also to call us out so that other people can share in this joy, in this liberation. And that's exactly what happened on Pentecost Sunday, is that those who had lived and walked with Jesus and been his disciples were then sent out to proclaim it, this good news, this new life possible. And so their liberation led them and compelled them to work for the liberation and the salvation of those gathered in Jerusalem that day. It's all the Christian story, exactly what you're talking about. And the moment that we make it just about ourselves is when we miss the point.
We missed the point.
We totally missed the point. Wow. Super. Tyler, you're so smart. This is so fun. We should wrap it up, but I should bring you on again, because you're just a delight to talk to. And thank you for the work you're doing. And for the ways that you've challenged us with these ideas and these insights. And thanks for being my friend for, wow, how many years has it been now? 20 years. Thanks for being my friend for 20 years.
It's more than a pleasure. It's a responsibility and a privilege, I can say so.
A responsibility, and yes, you are responsible for me a lot of the time.
It's a joy. No, thank you for having me, and I'm excited to come visit you all one day. I have now 2 brothers that have moved to Denver, so I guess I'm and when I have my both best friend and brothers in Denver, I guess that's you're all pulling me in that direction one day.
Yeah, there's a guest room waiting for you. All right. Tyler, thanks for joining us. Listeners, thanks for sticking with us and being a part of this. Stay in peace, everyone.